Jake Parker, a high school student from the quiet town of Crestwood, that moment arrived one ordinary morning when he was running late for class. But his rush to school came to a sudden halt when he heard a faint, desperate cry coming from a parked car. What he found inside changed everything. A baby, trapped and helpless in the blistering heat. Jake's split-second decision saved a life, but what came after was something he never expected. His once simple days became filled with new challenges, self-doubt, and moments of clarity that reshaped his path. From that single act of bravery, a door opened to a future Jake never imagined, a chance to grow, to give back, and to discover what it truly means to make a difference. But every step forward wasn't easy. Some days tested his resolve, while others revealed the quiet strength he didn't know he had. And through it all, one question lingered. Was this moment just chance, or was it the beginning of his true calling? The sun rose slowly over Crestwood, painting the quiet town in soft amber light. The streets were calm, the world just waking up, but for Jake Parker, the day had already begun in chaos. He was running late again. Jake's alarm had blared at 6:30 a.m., but he had hit snooze 3 times before rolling out of bed. His small room, cluttered with old books, sketches, and clothes, felt like a maze as he scrambled to grab his things. His mom's voice floated down the hall. "Jake, you are going to miss the bus again." "Yeah, I know," Jake shouted back, stuffing papers into his backpack. Their house was modest, worn but filled with memories. The living room couch had sagged in the middle for years, but it was still the family's favorite spot. Jake's mom worked double shifts at a local diner to keep things steady after his dad passed away 5 years earlier. The weight of those years had left a quiet strain on the household, but Jake and his mom had made things work. Today, though, he had overslept again, and Mr. Thompson, his history teacher, was bound to give him detention. Jake bolted out the door, slamming it behind him. The crisp morning air hit his face as he sprinted down the sidewalk, weaving past neighbors setting out garbage cans and kids waiting for the school bus. "Just one more block," Jake muttered, willing himself forward. His legs ached, and his lungs burned as he neared the corner. He could see the school gates ahead, but before he could reach them, a strange sound stopped him cold. It was faint, a soft, muffled cry coming from across the street. Jake's eyes flicked toward the parking lot of a small grocery store. It was nearly empty except for one SUV, parked alone under the morning sun. The cry came again, weak, almost breathless. Jake's heart thudded as he walked toward the car. His stomach twisted when he looked through the window. Inside, strapped in a car seat, was a baby no older than 6 months. The baby's face was flushed, tiny fists pressed against the window. Its small mouth opened and closed, emitting fragile cries that grew weaker with each second. Sweat beaded on its skin. Jake's breath caught. "No, no way," he whispered, trying the door handle. It was locked. He pressed his hands to the glass. "Hey, is anyone here?" he shouted, looking around the empty parking lot. No one answered. His heart pounded. The baby's shallow breaths terrified him. The sun was climbing higher, and Jake knew how fast cars could turn into ovens. He ran around to each door still locked. He felt utterly helpless for a moment, torn between panic and action. Then his eyes landed on a rock near the curb. Jake picked it up with trembling fingers. He hesitated. "I am sorry," he whispered before raising it above his head. With a decisive swing, the rock hit the back window, and the glass shattered with a loud crack. A blast of heat rushed out as Jake reached through the broken window, careful to avoid the jagged edges. He unlocked the door and pulled it open. The baby was warm to the touch, too warm. Its body was limp in his arms. "You're going to be okay," Jake murmured, cradling the child close to his chest. "I've got you." He tightened his grip and looked toward the end of the street. Crestwood Community Clinic stood 3 blocks away. His heart raced. He had never run so fast in his life. Jake sprinted past shops, diners, and houses. People turned their heads as he ran by. some calling out in confusion. He heard none of it. His focus was on the small, fragile life in his arms. His arms ached as he reached the clinic's front entrance. The glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh as he stumbled inside, gasping for air. "Help!" His voice cracked. "Someone helps!" The waiting room went silent. Nurses and patients turned to look at the boy standing breathless in the doorway, holding a baby with flushed cheeks and shallow breaths. A nurse behind the reception desk sprang into action. She was a tall woman with steady hands and a calm demeanor. Her name tag read, Nurse Harris. She approached with quick but controlled steps. "Give me the baby," she said gently but firmly. Jake's grip tightened instinctively. The baby felt so fragile in his arms that he was terrified to let go. But Nurse Harris's calm eyes met his, and something in her gaze steadied him. With trembling hands, Jake handed the baby over. Nurse Harris turned and called to another nurse. "Get Dr. Reynolds, stat." She disappeared through the emergency room doors, leaving Jake standing in the middle of the waiting room, dizzy with exhaustion. He stumbled toward a chair and sank into it, his breath coming in ragged gulps. The world seemed to blur. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above him. He buried his face in his hands, the adrenaline still surging through his veins. Murmurs filled the room as the waiting patients whispered to one another. "What happened?" an older man asked. "I think he saved that baby," a woman murmured in awe. Jake could barely hear them. His mind replayed every second the faint cries, the locked car, the searing heat, and the baby's fragile body in his arms. Minutes passed like hours. Jake lifted his head when he heard footsteps approaching. Nurse Harris had returned. Her face was calm, but serious. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The baby is stable," she said softly. "It was close, but you got here in time." Jake exhaled a shaky breath, the weight of her words settling over him. Relief washed through him, but questions tugged at his mind. Is the baby going to be okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Nurse Harris nodded, a small smile breaking across her face. "Yes, you did the right thing." Jake leaned back in his chair, the exhaustion catching up with him. The tension in his chest eased slightly, though a lingering heaviness remained. "You saved a life today," Nurse Harris said quietly. Jake looked down at his hands, still trembling. He hadn't felt brave, he had felt terrified. But sitting there in the quiet of the clinic, he realized something important. Sometimes, doing the right thing wasn't about feeling brave. It was about choosing to act, even when you were scared. And that choice had changed everything. Jake sat in the waiting room, his body still and exhausted, but his mind raced in loops. The baby's flushed cheeks and fragile breaths haunted him, playing over and over in his head, like a scene he couldn't escape. The antiseptic scent of the clinic stung his nose, grounding him back in reality. His hands still felt warm where the baby had rested, as though the memory had left a physical mark. The clinic doors slid open again, but this time it wasn't a doctor or nurse. Two police officers stepped in, their dark uniforms sharp against the pale walls. The older officer, tall and sturdy with salt and pepper hair, scanned the room before his eyes landed on Jake. "You the one who brought the baby in?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Jake nodded, his throat dry. The officer's expression softened slightly as he pulled out a small notepad. He gestured to an empty chair beside Jake. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. "Okay." The officer sat and introduced himself. "Officer Grayson, this is Officer Lee," he added, nodding toward his younger partner, who stood quietly by the desk, observing. Grayson flipped open his notepad and clicked his pen. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Jake swallowed hard, his voice still unsteady. "I was running to school. I was late. I heard this cry coming from the parking lot. I thought maybe it was a cat or something at first. But when I looked closer, I saw the baby in the back seat of the car, It didn't look right. The baby's face was red, and he paused, remembering how weak the cries had become. It was really hot in there. The doors were locked, so I broke the window to get him out. Grayson nodded as he jotted everything down. Did you see anyone else around? Anyone watching the car or walking away? Jake shook his head. No. The parking lot was empty. Grayson clicked his pen again and closed his notepad. You did something brave today, Jake. A lot of people would have just called 911 and waited. Jake's gaze dropped to his shoes. I couldn't wait. The baby didn't have that kind of time. Grayson's face remained thoughtful for a moment before he stood. The baby's parents have been contacted. They'll be here soon. Jake's chest tightened. What happens to them? Grayson sighed. That depends on what we find out. We need to know if this was an accident or… He didn't finish, but Jake understood. Before Grayson could say anything more, the double doors leading to the emergency wing opened, and Nurse Harris stepped out. She approached with a kind but tired smile. Jake, the baby's condition is improving. Dr. Reynolds said you probably saved his life by getting him here so quickly. Jake felt the words sink in, but they didn't sit the way he thought they would. Instead of relief, a strange heaviness settled in his chest. He had done something good, but the fact that it had come to this at all felt overwhelming. You should take a break, Nurse Harris said gently, leading him toward the small break room near the hallway. Get some water and catch your breath. Jake followed her without protest. The room was small and quiet, with a table, a few chairs, and a coffee machine humming softly. Nurse Harris handed him a water bottle and sat down across from him. Jake twisted the cap and took a sip, the cold water soothing his dry throat. How are you holding up? Nurse Harris asked. I don't know, Jake admitted after a pause. I didn't really think. I couldn't leave him there. She nodded, her gaze steady and reassuring. That instinct, most people do not have it. You did something incredible. Jake stared at his hands, still scraped from the glass shards. It doesn't feel incredible. Nurse Harris's voice softened. That is because you're still processing it. It takes time. Before Jake could respond, the break room door opened again. Officer Grayson stood in the doorway, and behind him were a man and a woman. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and red from crying. The man's shoulders were slumped, his face etched with guilt. Jake's stomach twisted. The parents. Nurse Harris rose and glanced at Jake. Do you want me to stay? She asked quietly. Jake nodded, grateful for her steady presence. The couple stepped inside. The woman's gaze went straight to Jake, her expression somewhere between heartbreak and gratitude. You're the one who saved our son, she said, her voice trembling. Jake stood, unsure of what to say. Yeah. Tears welled in her eyes. Thank you. I can't even… Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to hold back a sob. The man stepped forward, his eyes heavy with regret. I thought she had taken him out of the car when we got to the store. I didn't realize… Not until… His words faltered. Jake felt a knot of emotions rise in his chest. Anger, confusion, pity. You forgot? He asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The man winced. I thought… He trailed off, unable to finish. Jake shook his head. He almost… The words caught in his throat, too painful to say aloud. Nurse Harris placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, her touch grounding him. It was a terrible mistake, she said gently, and they will have to live with that. The woman took a shaky step closer. But because of you, we still have him. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photo frame wrapped in tissue paper. We wanted you to have this. Jake unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a photo of the baby, healthy, smiling, bright-eyed. Beneath the photo, an engraved message read, You gave us hope. Thank you. Jake stared at it, speechless. The mother's voice wavered as she added, We will never forget what you did." Officer Grayson cleared his throat softly, signaling that it was time for the parents to step back. They nodded, glancing at Jake one last time before following him out of the room. As the door clicked shut, Jake sat back down, staring at the picture in his hands. Nurse Harris watched him, her expression kind but knowing. "How are you feeling now?" she asked gently. Jake blinked, his voice quiet but steady. I finally believe it. I saved his life." Nurse Harris nodded. "Yes, you did." Jake's grip on the photo tightened as a new thought settled over him, not just relief, but a quiet determination. For the first time, he wondered if this moment was the start of something bigger. The clinic hallway was quiet as Jake stepped out of the break room, the photo still in his hand. His thoughts swirled as he replayed everything: the baby's fragile cries, the unbearable heat in the car, the parents' guilt-stricken faces. He wandered toward the waiting area, unsure of what to do next. He felt numb, as though the weight of the morning hadn't fully hit him yet. Outside, sunlight poured in through the large clinic windows, bright and indifferent, as though the world had already moved on. "Jake!" He turned to see a familiar figure striding through the entrance. Chris Bailey, his best friend since elementary school, rushed toward him, his eyes wide. "Man, it's all over town. People are saying you smashed a car window and saved a baby's life." Jake rubbed the back of his neck. "I guess I did." Chris gawked at him. "You guess? Dude, that's insane. You're like a hero or something." Jake's stomach twisted at the word hero. He didn't feel like one. All he could think about was how close it had been. "I just did what I had to do." Chris lowered his voice, sensing Jake's unease. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake hesitated. "I don't know." His shoulders slumped. "It's a lot to take in." Chris nodded, his excitement fading into concern. "Yeah, I get that. But I'm proud of you, man." "Everyone is." Jake gave a small, tired smile. "Thanks." Just then, Nurse Harris appeared again, clipboard in hand. "Jake, I just wanted to let you know that you're free to go. The police may need to follow up with you later, but for now, you've done everything you can." Jake felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. "Okay." Chris clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, I'll walk with you." The two of them walked side by side down Crestwood's quiet main street. The morning rush had settled into a calm hum as shop owners opened their doors and neighbors chatted outside cafes. But Jake barely noticed any of it. Chris glanced sideways at him. "You sure you're okay?" Jake sighed. "I keep thinking, what if I hadn't heard the baby? What if I hadn't gotten there in time?" Chris was quiet for a moment. "But you did hear him. And you did get there in time." He kicked a small pebble across the sidewalk. "Look, I know you're beating yourself up, but you saved that kid. That's what matters." Jake knew Chris was right, but the what-ifs still clung to him like shadows. As they passed the local diner, the door swung open, and Mrs. Alvarez, the owner, stepped out with a broom. She paused when she saw Jake. Her eyes softened, and she gave him a warm smile. "Jake Parker," she said kindly, "I heard what you did." She put a hand over her heart. "That baby is alive because of you. You're a good boy. Your mom would be so proud." Jake's throat tightened. "Thanks, Mrs. Alvarez." She nodded and reached back inside the diner, pulling out a small paper bag. "Here, it's on the house." Jake opened the bag to find a blueberry muffin, still warm. Chris grinned. "See? Hero perks?" Jake shook his head but smiled despite himself. "Thanks again," he said to Mrs. Alvarez. She gave him a final nod before heading back inside. As Jake and Chris continued walking, the small gesture of kindness stayed with him, like a reminder that people could be good even when life wasn't. When Jake got home, the house was quiet. His mom's purse was still by the door, a sign she hadn't left for work yet. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up when he walked in, and her face filled with both relief and worry. "Jake." "Hey, Mom." He set his backpack down and sank into the chair across from her. "I got a call from Officer Grayson," she said, folding her hands tightly. "He told me everything." Her voice wavered slightly. "You could have been hurt." Jake met her gaze. "I know, but I couldn't just leave him there." Tears welled in her eyes as she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You did the right thing." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the morning hanging between them. Finally, she gave him a small, teary smile. "You are so much like your dad." The mention of his father sent a familiar ache through Jake's chest. "He would have done the same thing, right?" She nodded. "He always helped people, no matter what." Jake felt something settle inside him like a piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The next morning, Jake woke early. Sleep had been restless, filled with disjointed dreams of sunlit parking lots and distant cries. But when he opened his eyes, he felt steadier. He got dressed, grabbed his backpack, and headed for school. By the time he reached the gates, students were already clustered in groups, talking and laughing. But as soon as they saw Jake, conversations hushed, and heads turned. "That's him," someone whispered. "The guy who saved the baby." Jake's stomach tightened. He didn't want the attention, but there was no avoiding it. As he walked down the hall, people gave him nods and pats on the back. Even Mr. Thompson, his history teacher, paused as Jake entered the classroom. "Mr. Parker," Mr. Thompson said, his voice unusually kind. "I heard about what happened. I think I speak for everyone when I say, well done." Jake felt his cheeks flush. "Thanks." Class went on as usual, but Jake's mind wandered. For the first time, he wondered if his future could be different, if there was something more for him beyond the routines of school and the quiet streets of Crestwood. During lunch, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Nurse Harris. "If you're up for it, I'd like you to come by the clinic again soon. I think there's something important you need to see." Jake stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I'll be there." A quiet but persistent thought settled in his mind, one he hadn't let himself fully acknowledge until now. Maybe this was just the beginning. The following afternoon, Jake found himself standing outside Crestwood Community Clinic once again. The glass doors reflected the late afternoon sun, the same ones he had burst through in a panic just a day ago. Now, though, the air was calm, the sky painted with lazy streaks of orange and gold. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cool, sterile air greeted him as he crossed the waiting room. Nurse Harris was already there, clipboard in hand, her warm smile easing some of the tension in his chest. "Jake," she greeted, waving him over. "Thanks for coming." Jake adjusted the strap of his backpack and walked toward her. "You said you wanted to show me something?" She nodded and motioned for him to follow her down the hallway. The clinic was quieter than it had been yesterday. Most of the rooms were empty, save for the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional murmur from behind a door. Jake's sneakers squeaked softly on the tile floor. Is the baby okay?" he asked, his voice low. Nurse Harris glanced at him with a reassuring look. "He's doing much better. Dr. Reynolds says his vitals have stabilized and he's on the road to a full recovery." She paused as they reached a door at the end of the hall. "There's someone here who wanted to see you." Jake's heart thudded in his chest as Nurse Harris opened the door. Inside was a small room with a cushioned chair and a small bed where the baby lay, bundled in a soft blue blanket. His eyes were open now, bright and curious, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling. Jake felt his breath catch. The baby looked completely different, full of life, instead of fragile and flushed. But it wasn't just the baby who was there. The mother stood by the bed, her face softer now, though her eyes still carried traces of yesterday's tears. The father sat in the chair beside her, holding the baby's small hand. The moment Jake stepped inside, both parents looked up. The mother straightened. her expression caught somewhere between nerves and gratitude. "You came," she whispered. Jake nodded, unsure what to say. He felt out of place, like he had wandered into a moment too intimate for him to witness. The father rose from his chair, his movements slow and careful. I don't know how to begin," he said, his voice rough. "We owe you everything." The mother stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly together. "We've told him, our son, how lucky he is, how you saved him." She let out a soft, shaky breath. "I don't know if he'll ever remember that day, but we'll make sure he knows about you." Jake stared at the baby, who let out a soft coo and wiggled in the blanket. A tiny hand reached up toward the ceiling, as if grasping at invisible stars. "You named him yet?" Jake asked after a moment. The mother smiled gently. "Nathan. His name is Nathan." Jake's lips twitched upward. "Nathan," he repeated, the name fitting somehow. The father reached for something on the bedside table, a small rectangular box wrapped in blue paper. He held it out to Jake. "We wanted you to have this. It's not much, but we wanted you to remember how much you've done for us." Jake hesitated before accepting the box. He pulled the paper aside carefully and opened it. Inside was a small silver picture frame with an engraved message along the bottom. "You gave us hope." Jake's throat tightened as he stared at the frame. It held a picture of Nathan, healthy and smiling. "You don't have to thank me," Jake said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I just did what anyone would have done." The mother's eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You didn't hesitate. You didn't look for someone else to handle it. You acted." Jake didn't know how to respond. He felt exposed under the weight of their gratitude, like it was too much for him to carry. The baby let out a soft gurgle, and Jake's attention shifted. The sight of Nathan, alive and well, sent a warmth through him that chased away some of the heaviness. He reached out, letting Nathan's tiny hand wrap around his finger. The baby's grip was surprisingly strong. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to truly believe it. Nathan was okay because of him. Nurse Harris waited outside the room as Jake stepped out a few minutes later. She watched him closely, noticing the thoughtful look on his face. "How do you feel?" she asked. Jake took a deep breath. "Different," he admitted. "I don't know how to explain it." She nodded knowingly. "Sometimes, seeing the outcome changes everything." Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah," he paused, then asked, "Why did you want me to come back here?" Nurse Harris leaned against the wall, her eyes thoughtful. "Because I wanted you to understand something. What you did, it was more than a reaction. It showed who you are. You didn't wait for someone else to step in. You made a choice, even when it was hard. That matters, Jake." Jake looked down at the picture frame in his hand. "I didn't feel brave. I just felt scared." Nurse Harris's smile was gentle. "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Jake let those words settle. The sun had begun to set as Jake left the clinic, casting Crestwood in shades of gold and deep amber. His thoughts swirled, but they no longer felt as heavy. Chris was waiting for him at the corner, arms crossed. He straightened as Jake approached. "So, what happened?" Jake held up the picture frame. "They wanted me to have this." Chris peered at the photo and whistled. "Wow, that's kind of amazing." Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it is." As they walked home, the quiet buzz of the town around them, Jake felt something unfamiliar, something steady and strong. It wasn't just pride, it was purpose. For the first time, he wasn't haunted by what might have gone wrong. Instead, he felt grounded in what had gone right. Nathan was safe, the family was whole. And maybe, just maybe, Jake had found something in himself that he hadn't known was there. The next few days passed in a blur for Jake. The halls of Crestwood High buzzed with whispers as news of his actions spread. He couldn't walk to class without someone stopping him to ask, "Were you really the one who saved that baby?" Teachers smiled at him with pride, and students who had barely spoken to him before now treated him like a local celebrity. Even Mr. Thompson, his notoriously gruff history teacher, paused during roll call and gave Jake an approving nod. "Well done, Mr. Parker," he said, adjusting his glasses. "The world could use more people like you." Jake shifted in his seat, heat rising to his face. "Thanks," he mumbled. Despite the praise, Jake felt out of place. He didn't feel like a hero, just a kid who had been in the right place at the right time. At lunch, he and Chris sat at their usual table near the windows. Chris was still animated, talking with his mouth half full of fries. "Dude, did you see the post on the town's community page? Someone called you the Crestwood Guardian." Jake groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "You've got to be kidding me." Chris laughed. "You're like a real-life superhero. Maybe I should start calling you Captain Courage." Jake shook his head. "Please don't." Chris grinned, but his expression softened after a moment. "Seriously, though, how are you holding up?" Jake hesitated, then shrugged. "It's weird. Everyone's acting like I did something incredible, but I didn't plan to. I just saw the baby and knew I had to help." Chris leaned back, thoughtful for once. "Sometimes, that's the kind of incredible that matters most." Jake didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window, lost in thought. That evening, Jake sat at the kitchen table, his textbooks spread out in front of him. His mom was bustling around the kitchen, reheating leftovers from the diner. She paused when she noticed Jake staring blankly at his history notes. "You've been quiet since you got home," she said, sitting down across from him. "Something on your mind?" Jake sighed. "Everyone keeps calling me a hero, but I don't feel like one." His mom tilted her head, a soft smile on her face. "Why not?" "Because I didn't do anything special," Jake said, fidgeting with his pen. "I was scared. I didn't know if what I was doing would even work." His mom reached across the table and rested a hand on his. "Jake, being scared doesn't make you any less brave. What matters is that you didn't let that fear stop you." Jake's eyes flicked to the framed picture of his dad on the kitchen counter. His dad had been a firefighter, a man who had saved lives as part of his job. "Dad wasn't scared," Jake muttered. His mom's smile grew sad, but understanding. "Your dad was scared plenty of times. He just didn't let it stop him. And neither did you." Jake thought about her words long after dinner was over. The next morning, just as he was about to leave for school, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Nurse Harris. "Hey, Jake, the clinic has been thinking about starting a volunteer program. I thought of you first. Would you be interested in stopping by this weekend to see what it's like? No pressure, just an invitation." Jake stared at the message, his heart skipping a beat. The idea of volunteering at the clinic felt important, but it also felt intimidating. He wasn't sure he was ready to be part of something so big. Still, something about it tugged at him. By the time lunch rolled around, Jake's mind was made up. He showed the message to Chris, who read it and let out a low whistle. "Dude, this could be huge. Are you gonna do it?" Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I will." Chris grinned. "I'm proud of you, Captain Courage." Jake rolled his eyes but couldn't help smiling. On Saturday morning, Jake stood outside the clinic's entrance again. This time there was no fear, no panic, just nerves and anticipation. The doors slid open, and Nurse Harris greeted him with her usual calm smile. "I'm glad you came," she said, leading him inside. The clinic was quieter than usual, and the sunlight streaming through the windows made everything feel warm and peaceful. She led him down the familiar hallway toward the staff room. "Volunteering here isn't about knowing everything," she explained as they walked. "It's about helping where you can offer a kind word, handing someone a glass of water, or just listening." Jake nodded, taking it all in. They stopped in front of a door marked "Storage." Inside were shelves lined with bandages, gloves, syringes, and neatly labeled boxes of supplies. Nurse Harris handed him a clipboard and a pair of gloves. "We're restocking some of the rooms today. I thought we'd start here." Jake slipped the gloves on, feeling a little awkward, but determined. "Okay, what do I do?" Nurse Harris showed him how to check inventory and fill the bins. As they worked, she talked about life at the clinic, the long shifts, the tough days, and the small moments that made it all worthwhile. "There are days when you wonder if what you're doing makes a difference," she said, stacking boxes of gauze. "But then there are days, like the one with Nathan, when you know it does." Jake's hand paused over a box of syringes. "I didn't really know what I was doing that day," he admitted. "You knew enough to act," Nurse Harris replied. "Sometimes that's enough." Jake let her words settle as they finished organizing the supplies. A few hours later, they walked back toward the lobby. Just as they reached the front desk, a mother and her young son walked in for a checkup. The boy, around 5, clung nervously to his mom's hand, his eyes wide. Nurse Harris crouched down to greet him. "Hi there, what's your name?" "Daniel," the boy mumbled. Jake watched as Nurse Harris spoke softly, easing Daniel's nerves. When she stood, she nudged Jake gently. "Think you can keep Daniel company while I grab his chart?" Jake hesitated, but Daniel's nervous glance tugged at his heart. He crouched down to the boy's level and gave him a smile. "Hey, Daniel, do you like dinosaurs?" Daniel blinked, then nodded shyly. Jake grinned. "Cool, me too. What's your favorite one?" As Daniel's face lit up, and he began talking excitedly about T-Rexes and velociraptors, Jake felt something bloom in his chest, an unexpected warmth. The same connection he'd felt when he'd held Nathan for the first time. By the time Nurse Harris returned, Daniel was giggling and completely at ease. She gave Jake an approving smile. "You've got a knack for this," she said as they walked back to the hallway. Jake shrugged, but he couldn't hide the pride in his smile. As he left the clinic that day, the air felt different, lighter. He wasn't just someone who had stumbled into an emergency. He was someone who could make a difference. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was drifting. He felt like he was finding his way. Monday morning came with a crisp chill in the air, the kind that hinted at fall's arrival. The streets of Crestwood were quiet as Jake walked to school, but for the first time in a while, his mind wasn't weighed down by worry or doubt. Instead, it was buzzing with a sense of purpose. He had spent the entire weekend thinking about his first day volunteering at the clinic, about Daniel's laughter, Nurse Harris's quiet guidance, and the way the small, simple tasks made him feel like he was part of something bigger. By the time he reached the school gates, the hallways were already alive with the chatter of students. Whispers still followed him wherever he went. "That's Jake Parker, right? The kid who saved that baby?" "Yeah, I heard he's volunteering at the clinic now." Jake kept his head down, trying to focus on making it to class without being stopped. When he reached his locker, Chris was already there, leaning casually against the metal door, grinning. "How was it, man? Your first official shift?" Jake smiled as he twisted the lock. "It was, good. Different. I liked it." Chris nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "You looked different when you left the clinic on Saturday. Like, more confident or something." Jake shrugged, pulling out his history book. "It's weird, but I feel like I'm finally figuring out what I want to do with my life." Chris's grin widened. "You, Mr. I'll figure it out later? This is huge." Jake laughed softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, maybe later finally caught up with me." The rest of the day passed in a blur of lessons and notes, but Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to the clinic. When the final bell rang, he gathered his things and headed toward the exit. But as he reached the front steps, a voice called out, "Jake, wait!" He turned to see Mr. Thompson, his history teacher, hurrying toward him. "Mind if I walk with you for a bit?" Jake blinked in surprise but nodded. Sure." They walked in silence for a few moments before Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. "I heard about what you've been doing at the clinic," he began. "It's impressive." Jake glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "Thanks." Mr. Thompson stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets. "I've been teaching at Crestwood High for 25 years. I've seen a lot of students come and go, some aimless, some ambitious, but I don't think I've ever seen someone change so much in such a short time." Jake felt his face flush. "I don't know if I've changed. I just feel like I finally know what matters." Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "That's a rare thing to figure out at your age." They stopped at the corner, where the school path split toward different neighborhoods. Mr. Thompson turned to Jake, his expression serious but kind. "If you ever need help college recommendations, advice, my door's open." Jake's eyes widened. "Really?" Mr. Thompson smiled faintly. "Really. People notice when someone steps up, Jake. And you've stepped up in a big way." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with something that felt suspiciously like pride. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson. I'll keep that in mind." That evening, as Jake sat at the kitchen table working through his history homework, his phone buzzed with another message from Nurse Harris. "We're short-handed tomorrow afternoon. If you're free, I could use an extra set of hands." Jake's fingers hovered over the screen for only a second before he typed back, "I'll be there." His mom looked up from her paperwork at the sound of his phone buzzing. "Clinic again?" she asked with a knowing smile. Jake nodded. "They need help tomorrow." His mom's eyes softened. "You really like it there, don't you?" Jake hesitated, then nodded again. "Yeah, I do." She set her pen down and folded her hands. "Your dad would have loved this. He always believed in helping others, no matter how small the gesture." Jake looked at her, his throat tightening. "You think I'm like him?" She smiled gently. "More than you know." The next afternoon, Jake returned to the clinic, the familiar hum of activity welcoming him. Nurse Harris met him at the front desk, handing him a clipboard. "Thanks for coming," she said. "We've got a few checkups today and some new supplies that need to be organized." Jake nodded. "Got it." The day passed in a steady rhythm, handing out water, restocking supplies, and helping patients feel at ease. He found himself growing more confident with each task, moving with a quiet efficiency that even surprised him. Just as things were starting to wind down, Nurse Harris appeared with a curious look on her face. "There's someone here who wanted to check in," she said, her voice warm. Jake followed her to one of the exam rooms. His heart skipped when he saw who was inside. Nathan's parents were there, seated with the baby on the mother's lap. Nathan was giggling, his chubby hands reaching for a set of brightly colored keys that jingled in his mom's hand. The father looked up and smiled when he saw Jake. "We wanted to see how everything was going, and to thank you again." Jake couldn't help but smile as he crouched to Nathan's level. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Nathan's eyes lit up as he reached out and grabbed Jake's finger, holding tight. The mother's eyes shimmered with emotion as she watched them. "We tell him about you all the time," she said. "You're a part of his story now." Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. As he stood, the father extended his hand. "You changed our lives, Jake." Jake shook his hand, his grip firm but humble. "He changed mine too." As Jake left the clinic that evening, he paused on the steps and looked out at the fading sun. The horizon stretched out wide and open, painted in hues of gold and crimson. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was drifting aimlessly through life. He felt grounded, with purpose in every step he took. The baby he had saved was safe. The family he had helped was whole. And somehow, through all of it, he had discovered something new in himself. Something steady, strong, and real. This wasn't just a chapter in his life. It was a beginning. By the time Jake walked into school the next morning, everything felt different, though he couldn't quite explain why. The familiar hum of morning chatter filled the hallways, but this time, Jake didn't feel like an outsider drifting through it all. He felt steady, anchored by something bigger than himself. Chris caught up to him near his locker, a wide grin plastered across his face. "I saw you leaving the clinic yesterday," he said, nudging Jake's shoulder. "You looked like you were glowing. Did they promote you to clinic MVP or something?" Jake rolled his eyes but chuckled. "No." Nathan's parents stopped by. "It kind of hit me how much that day changed things for all of us." Chris's smile softened. "Yeah, man, that's huge. You didn't just save their baby, you gave them their future back?" Jake let those words settle as he grabbed his books. "I never thought of it like that." Chris gave a dramatic sigh. "Well, I hope you're ready for more hero worship. Half the town's still talking about you. Oh, and there's a flyer for a pre-med mentorship meeting on the bulletin board." Jake paused mid-step. "Pre-med?" Chris nodded. "Yeah, some program at the community college. Thought you'd be interested." Jake's mind raced as they headed toward class. Pre-med. He had never even considered it before. But now, after everything that had happened, the idea didn't seem so far-fetched. Later that day, between classes, Jake found himself standing in front of the school's bulletin board. The flyer Chris had mentioned was tacked to the corner, bright blue with bold letters, "Future Healers Program, Explore Careers in Medicine." The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. Jake tore off one of the tabs with the contact information, staring at it as if it held the answer to a question he didn't know he had asked. A voice behind him made him jump. "Thinking about it?" Jake turned to see Mr. Thompson holding a stack of papers. Jake nodded. "Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm ready for something like this, though." Mr. Thompson smiled. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to show up and see what it's about." He gestured to the flyer. "Sometimes, opportunities knock quietly. It's up to you to open the door." Jake nodded slowly. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson." The rest of the week flew by, and before Jake knew it, Saturday morning arrived. He stood outside the community college's lecture hall, nerves knotting his stomach. The room inside was already half full. Students from different schools sat at long tables, talking in low voices. A woman in a white coat stood at the front of the room, adjusting a projector. Jake took a deep breath and stepped inside, finding an empty seat near the middle. The woman at the front clapped her hands to get everyone's attention. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Patel, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the Future Healers program." She spoke with energy and warmth, explaining how the program would give students a hands-on look at careers in healthcare. She shared stories from her own journey, from her first nerve-wracking days in medical school to moments of connection with patients that had changed her life. Jake listened intently, every word sinking in. By the time the meeting ended, he felt something shift within him. This wasn't just some distant dream, this was something real. And maybe, just maybe, it was something he could do. As the other students filed out, Dr. Patel caught Jake's eye and walked over. "You were paying close attention," she said, smiling. Jake nodded. "It was inspiring." Dr. Patel crossed her arms, studying him. "Do you volunteer anywhere?" "At the Crestwood Clinic," Jake replied. "Just started last week." Her smile grew wider. "That's wonderful. We need more people like you in this field." She handed him a folder. "If you decide to apply for the mentorship, everything you need is in here." Jake held the folder tightly, his nerves buzzing. "Thank you." When Jake got home, he sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder. Inside was an application form, a list of program requirements, and a letter explaining what the mentorship would involve. His mom walked in and paused when she saw him reading. "What's that?" Jake looked up, unsure how to put it into words. "It's for a pre-med mentorship program. I think I want to apply." His mom's eyes softened with pride. "Jake, that's amazing." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Are you nervous?" Jake nodded. "A little. What if I'm not good enough?" His mom reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You're more than good enough, and you don't have to have all the answers today. Just take it one step at a time." Jake felt a familiar warmth spread through him. "Thanks, Mom." The following Monday, Jake walked into the clinic after school, determined. Nurse Harris greeted him with her usual smile, but when she saw the look in his eyes, her expression shifted to curiosity. "You look like someone with something to say," she remarked. Jake took a deep breath. "I think I want to pursue medicine. I went to a mentorship meeting this weekend. It made me realize that I want to help people not just in emergencies, but as a career." Nurse Harris's face lit up with pride. "Jake, that's incredible. You've always had it in you. You just needed to see it for yourself." As they walked down the hallway together, Jake felt lighter than he had in weeks. He wasn't just reacting to life anymore, he was shaping it. By the end of his shift, the clinic's familiar hum of activity had begun to feel like home. The steady rhythm of footsteps, quiet conversations, and the occasional laughter from a child no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt like something he could be a part of, something that gave him purpose. When he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he glanced at the sky, where the first stars had begun to appear. He didn't know where this path would lead him, but for the first time, the future didn't feel like a blur of uncertainty. It felt like an open road. The air outside the clinic was crisp and cool as Jake walked home, the folder from the mentorship program tucked securely under his arm. The streetlights flickered on as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Crestwood's quiet streets. The weight of his decision to pursue something bigger than he'd ever imagined pressed against his thoughts. But it wasn't a bad kind of weight. It felt real. When he got home, his mom was stirring a pot of soup in the kitchen. The familiar smell of garlic and herbs filled the small house, warm and comforting. "You're home later than usual," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Long shift at the clinic?" Jake set the folder down on the table and hung his jacket on the back of the chair. "Yeah, Nurse Harris let me shadow her during some of the checkups." His mom's smile grew. "Shadowing already? Look at you." Jake chuckled as he sank into the chair. "It's kind of crazy, huh? A few weeks ago, I wasn't even thinking about any of this. Now, it feels like everything's changed." She ladled soup into 2 bowls and set one in front of him. "Sometimes life changes in ways you don't expect, and all you can do is decide if you're ready to step up." Jake nodded, the warmth of the soup matching the warmth in his chest. "I think I am." The next morning at school, Jake felt a renewed focus. His teachers noticed, too, especially Mr. Thompson, who raised an eyebrow when Jake stayed after class to ask about extra credit. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, amused. "Well, this is a surprise. To what do I owe the honor?" Jake grinned sheepishly. "I'm applying for a pre-med mentorship. I want to make sure I'm doing everything I can to prepare." Mr. Thompson's face softened, his usual dry humor giving way to genuine pride. "I knew there was more to you than what you let on, Parker. I'll see what I can do to help." By the time Saturday rolled around, Jake had filled out the application, double-checked it twice, and finally slipped it into the mailbox at the post office. His nerves buzzed as he let the metal door clang shut, as though that simple act had made everything official. Chris was waiting for him outside, holding a paper cup of coffee and blowing on the steam. "Well, did you do it?" Jake nodded, his heart still racing. "It's done." Chris let out a low whistle. "Man, you're really doing this." Jake shrugged, though he couldn't hide his excitement. "Yeah, I am." Chris handed him a second cup of coffee. "You're going to kill it, dude. I know you will." Jake took a sip, the warmth of the coffee easing some of his nerves. "Thanks, Chris." They walked back through town, chatting about school and soccer, but every so often, Jake's mind wandered to the future. He knew the mentorship program wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to try. The following week, Jake's routine became a mix of school, volunteering, and waiting. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt a rush of nerves, wondering if it was news about the mentorship. One afternoon, just as his shift at the clinic was ending, Nurse Harris approached him with a curious smile. "Jake, do you have a minute?" He nodded, setting aside the folder of patient charts he had been organizing. "Sure. What's up?" She led him to her office, a small but cozy room filled with family photos and a framed certificate of her nursing degree. She gestured for him to sit before taking a seat behind her desk. "You've been volunteering for a few weeks now," she began, her tone warm but serious. "And I've been keeping an eye on you." Jake's heart skipped. "Did I do something wrong?" Nurse Harris laughed softly. "No, nothing like that. I wanted to tell you how impressed I've been. You're not just going through the motions, you're engaged, thoughtful, and compassionate. That's rare." Jake felt his face flush. "Thanks. That means a lot." She leaned forward, resting her hands on her desk. "I'm not saying this to make you feel good. I'm telling you because I believe you found your place here. You remind me of why I started in healthcare in the first place." Jake's throat tightened. He wasn't used to praise like this, especially from someone like Nurse Harris, who had seen it all. "I wanted to ask you something," she continued. "If you're accepted into the mentorship program, would you consider continuing to volunteer here during school breaks? I think you're exactly the kind of person we need." Jake nodded, barely able to contain his smile. "Absolutely. I'd love that." A few days later, Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, finishing his homework, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and froze. "Congratulations!" The email began. "You've been selected for the Future Healers Mentorship Program." Jake reread the email twice, his heart pounding in disbelief. "Mom!" he called out, jumping up from his chair. His mom appeared in the doorway, a dish towel in her hand. "What is it?" "I got in!" Jake's voice cracked with excitement. "The mentorship program, they accepted me." His mom's eyes lit up as she rushed forward and hugged him tightly. "Jake, that's amazing." Jake laughed, a mix of joy and disbelief filling him. "I didn't think I'd actually get in." His mom pulled back, her eyes shining. "Of course you did. You've worked so hard for this." The first day of the mentorship was a whirlwind. The program's mentors were doctors, nurses, and medical students who shared their experiences and taught hands-on skills like taking vitals and reading basic patient charts. Dr. Patel was there, greeting each of the mentees with the same warm smile she'd worn at the introductory meeting. "Jake Parker," she said as he walked in. "Welcome aboard." Jake smiled back, feeling a strange but steady confidence settle over him. "Thanks. I'm excited to be here." Throughout the day, Jake soaked in everything like a sponge. He asked questions, took notes, and practiced the techniques they taught. At one point, Dr. Patel walked over to observe him as he practiced taking a mock patient's pulse. "You've got a calm, steady approach," she noted. "That's rare in someone just starting out." Jake looked up, surprised. "I guess I've had some practice at the clinic." Dr. Patel nodded. "That makes sense. You're going to do well here, Jake." Jake's heart swelled as he realized something important. He wasn't just keeping up, he belonged here. By the time the session ended, Jake felt both exhausted and exhilarated. As he stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, the world seemed brighter, the future more open than ever before. For the first time, he wasn't just dreaming of making a difference, he was doing it. The first few weeks of the mentorship program flew by, each day bringing new challenges and lessons. Jake spent his weekends at the community college and his afternoons at the Crestwood Clinic. Between school, volunteering, and studying, his schedule was packed. But for the first time in his life, the busy pace didn't feel overwhelming. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But not every day was easy. Some lessons were harder to learn than others. One Friday afternoon at the clinic, Jake was helping Nurse Harris with patient intake. The waiting room was busier than usual, filled with tired faces and quiet murmurs. A woman with two small children sat near the window, trying to soothe her youngest, who was fussing loudly. An older man with a cough that rattled in his chest sat nearby, his head resting in his hands. Jake walked over to the intake desk to grab another clipboard when he noticed a teenage boy sitting alone in the corner. He couldn't have been much older than Jake. His clothes were worn, and his shoulders were hunched like he was trying to disappear into the chair. Jake felt a tug of concern as he approached. "Hey," he said gently. "You okay?" The boy glanced up, his eyes guarded. "Yeah, just waiting." Jake hesitated. "Do you need water or anything? I can get you some." The boy shook his head but mumbled, "Thanks." Nurse Harris appeared beside Jake and gave him a small nod of approval. "That was good," she said softly as they walked back to the desk. "Sometimes people just need to know they've been noticed." Jake nodded, but the boy's haunted expression stayed with him. The next day at the mentorship session, Jake was more distracted than usual. Dr. Patel noticed during their practice rounds. "Jake," she said as she watched him take notes, "you seem off today. Everything okay?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure how to explain the ache in his chest. "There was this kid at the clinic yesterday," he admitted. "He looked lost." Dr. Patel studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's one of the hardest parts of this work. You'll see people at their most vulnerable, scared, uncertain, even hopeless. And sometimes you won't be able to fix that, but you can show up, and sometimes that's enough." Jake let her words sink in. The following week, Jake was back at the clinic for his usual volunteer shift. The flow of patients was steady, and he moved through his tasks with growing confidence. Midway through his shift, Nurse Harris approached him with a smile. "You're really finding your rhythm," she said. "How's the mentorship going?" Jake smiled. "It's intense, but I love it." He hesitated, then added, "It's made me realize how much I still have to learn." Nurse Harris's smile softened. "That feeling never really goes away, even after years in the field. But that's how you grow." As they spoke, the front door of the clinic opened, and a familiar figure stepped in. It was the boy Jake had noticed the week before. This time, his posture was different, more anxious, as if he'd built up the courage to return, but wasn't sure if he was welcome. Jake caught his eye and gave him a small nod. "Hey, you're back." The boy's tense shoulders relaxed slightly. "Yeah." He shifted awkwardly. I think I need to talk to someone." Nurse Harris stepped forward with calm assurance. "Of course. Let's get you signed in." Jake watched as she led the boy toward one of the private consultation rooms. He felt a quiet sense of relief sometimes. People just needed time before they were ready to ask for help. Later that day, as Jake was organizing supplies in the back room, Nurse Harris appeared at the door. "You made a difference today," she said softly. Jake looked up, surprised. "I didn't really do anything." She shook her head. "You noticed him. You reached out. That's not nothing, Jake." He felt a quiet warmth spread through him as he realized she was right. Sometimes it wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, simple moments that told people they mattered. That weekend, during the mentorship session, Dr. Patel introduced a new part of the program: hospital shadowing. The mentees would take turns spending a day at the city hospital, observing how doctors handled emergencies and routine care. Jake's nerves flared at the announcement, but he also felt a spark of excitement. When his turn came the following Friday, he arrived at the hospital early, dressed in his volunteer badge and scrubs. The place was massive compared to the Crestwood Clinic: bright lights, fast-moving staff, and the constant hum of activity. Dr. Patel greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome to the real front lines," she said, as she led him through the main hall. "It can be overwhelming, but remember, you're here to learn." Jake nodded, taking it all in. His first stop was the ER, where a doctor named Dr. Marshall introduced him to the flow of patient care. Jake watched as Dr. Marshall examined a young boy with a broken arm, speaking to the child in a calm, soothing voice that instantly put him at ease. Jake was struck by how much compassion mattered even in a place where the pace was relentless. At the end of his shift, Jake found Dr. Patel near the main entrance. She raised an eyebrow as she handed him a bottle of water. "How'd it goes?" Jake took a long sip before answering. "It was intense, but I think I needed to see it." Dr. Patel nodded approvingly. "You handled yourself well. You've got a good heart, Jake. That's not something you can teach." As he left the hospital, Jake felt the cool evening breeze hit his face. He thought about everything he'd seen: the patients, the doctors, the small moments that could make or break someone's day. He realized that resilience wasn't just about reacting in emergencies. It was about staying steady, even on the hardest days. As he walked home under the streetlights, he knew the road ahead would be tough, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Between his mentorship shifts, volunteering at the clinic, and keeping up with school, Jake's days felt longer but more meaningful than ever. He had learned so much from observing surgeries and shadowing doctors to simply holding space for someone who was scared and needed reassurance, but he also learned that it wasn't always about big, heroic moments. Sometimes, making a difference meant being present in the small moments that no one else noticed. One sunny afternoon, as Jake finished organizing a cart of medical supplies in the clinic's hallway, Nurse Harris appeared, a familiar glint in her eyes. "You have a visitor," she said with a knowing smile. Jake blinked. "A visitor?" She gestured toward the lobby. Jake followed her and froze when he saw who was waiting. Nathan's mother stood near the reception desk, holding her son in her arms. Nathan, now a toddler, had grown so much his once fragile frame was sturdy, his cheeks round and rosy. His bright eyes lit up when he saw Jake. "Hi, Jake," Nathan's mother said warmly, shifting Nathan on her hip. "We thought it was time for you to see how well he's doing." Jake crouched down to Nathan's level. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Nathan giggled and reached out, patting Jake's face with chubby fingers. Jake laughed, his chest swelling with warmth. "Do you remember me?" he asked jokingly. Nathan tilted his head curiously, then babbled something unintelligible. His mother smiled. "He may not remember that day, but he knows your name. We've told him the story so many times." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. Nathan's mother adjusted the toddler on her hip and spoke quietly. "I wanted you to know, you didn't just save his life that day. You changed ours. Every milestone Nathan reaches, every laugh we hear, it's because of you." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "We thought you should have this." Jake took the package and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed photo of Nathan, now healthy and full of life. The frame was engraved with the same words as before. "You gave us hope." Jake stared at it for a long moment, a lump rising in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered. Nathan's mother smiled. "No, thank you." They stayed for a few more minutes, chatting while Nathan toddled around and explored. When they left, Jake stood at the front desk, staring at the photo in his hands. Nurse Harris walked over and leaned against the counter. "Full circle, huh?" Jake nodded. "Yeah." Her voice was soft but steady. "You should be proud. Not everyone steps up when life calls on them. But you did." Jake exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her words settle over him. "It feels surreal," he admitted. "But I finally get it. I know why I'm here." A few months later, Jake's hard work began paying off in ways he hadn't expected. He was excelling in school, his grades climbing higher than they ever had before. Mr. Thompson pulled him aside after class one day, a college brochure in hand. "This came in from the guidance office," Mr. Thompson said, holding out the brochure. "I thought of you immediately." Jake took it, his eyes widening as he read the bold title, "Healthcare Scholarships for Future Medical Leaders." I I don't know what to say, Jake stammered. Mr. Thompson smiled. Say you'll consider applying. You've earned it. Jake nodded slowly, feeling the weight of possibility in his hands. The following summer, Jake was accepted into a pre-college program at a nearby university. It was a stepping stone towards something bigger, a chance to take advanced courses and prepare for the long journey ahead. Before he left, Nurse Harris gathered the clinic staff in the break room for a small send-off. There was cake, laughter, and heartfelt words. As Jake stood surrounded by the people who had guided him, Nurse Harris, his mom, his teachers, he realized just how much they had shaped his path. You've got everything you need to make this work, Nurse Harris said, as she handed him a card signed by the entire staff. Jake smiled, his heart full. I won't let you down. Years passed, filled with long nights of studying, early morning rotations, and moments of doubt that Jake pushed through with sheer determination. The memory of Nathan the baby who had sparked this entire journey stayed with him through it all, a quiet reminder of why he kept going. When Jake graduated from medical school, his mom, Chris, and Nurse Harris sat in the audience, cheering louder than anyone. After the ceremony, Jake spotted Nurse Harris waiting for him outside. You did it, she said, beaming. Jake laughed, his eyes bright. We did it, he corrected. She hugged him tightly. Your dad would be so proud. Jake swallowed hard. Thanks. That means everything. Several years later, Jake returned to Crestwood to open his own clinic in the heart of town. The modest building quickly became a beacon of hope for the community. It was a place where people were treated with kindness, respect, and care, regardless of their circumstances. One sunny afternoon, Jake was flipping through patient charts at the front desk when the door opened. A young woman stepped inside, holding the hand of a small boy who looked about 5 years old. Jake recognized her immediately. It was Nathan's mother. The boy's eyes lit up as he looked around the waiting room. Mom, is this the place you told me about? Nathan's mother smiled and nodded. Yes, this is where it all started. Jake crouched to the boy's level, grinning. Hey there. The boy tilted his head and smiled shyly. You're the doctor who saved me? Jake's heart swelled as he nodded. Yeah, I guess I am. The boy's small hand reached out, and Jake shook it gently. Nathan's mother watched with tears in her eyes. We wanted you to know. He's thriving because of you. Jake felt the full weight of everything: the past, the present, and the future. The moment he had picked up that rock to shatter the car window had changed so much more than one life. As the sun streamed through the windows, Jake watched Nathan and his mom leave, the sound of their laughter filling the room. He stood there for a long moment, letting the warmth of the memory settle deep within him. This wasn't just a career, it was his calling, and it had all started with one choice. The world felt wide open, and Jake was exactly where he was meant to be. Jake's journey reminds us that even the smallest acts of courage and kindness can spark incredible change, not only in the lives of others, but within ourselves. His story began with a simple choice: to step forward when it mattered most. That choice shaped his future, leading him toward purpose, resilience, and hope. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more inspiring tales of courage, perseverance, and heart, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that uplift, encourage, and remind us of the power of kindness. Thanks for watching, and remember, you never know how one small moment can change everything. See you in the next story.